Sidney Powell has flipped on Trump in Georgia. And if she has flipped on Trump in Georgia, she has also either flipped on Trump in Jack Smith's subversion case in Washington, or she's going to have to. Because now she will have to testify against Trump and the other 16 remaining defendants in Georgia. And since whatever she says there could be used against her in federal court, unless she takes a plea there, she has to have taken a plea there. Or she is finalizing one because she may be crazy, but to quote Elmer Fudd, I may be a scwewy wabbit, but I'm not going to Alcatwaz. They were going to start selecting her jury today, and the trial was to start Monday. And earlier this week, her lawyer said she'd done nothing wrong, and guess what? She, quote, did not represent President Trump or the Trump campaign, unquote, despite all those news conferences and TV hits and those Georgia voting machines she'd broken into that she had explicit permission to do that from the Kraken, I guess. And the importance of all this simply cannot be overstated. To get her plea deal, her 6 years of probation, her felonies reduced to misdemeanors, her $8,700 in fines, she had to plead guilty to election interference. Jack Smith may or may not have made deals with the other unindicted co-conspirators in his election subversion case, and it sure looks like he has some sort of arrangement with Mark Meadows to break from official Trump policy and tell the truth. But an actual plea with testimony deal with Sidney Powell would have overwhelming implications. As this news broke, the emphasis was on the about face it constitutes, that here's a complete turnaround by the Kraken lady, that bizarre figure who looks like, to invoke another cartoon, a badly drawn version of Lois Griffin's mother. The woman who believed that the 2020 election was somehow stolen by Hugo Chavez and the Cubans and the Chinese, even though Hugo Chavez is dead. The story was, and is still in many quarters viewed as, just a wacky denouement to the wackiest end of Trump's often wacky and laughable conspiracy to just overturn the election and end American democracy. In fact, Sidney Powell is a dagger pointed at Trump's heart. She takes Fani Willis, and we can assume she will take Jack Smith, inside the infamous December 18th meeting at the White House with Mike Flynn and the crazy founder of Overstock.com and crazy Rudy Giuliani and Meadows and everybody screaming at everybody else, and she and Flynn demanding Trump sign the executive order they had written for him, getting the military to seize the voting machines and use the National Guard to rerun the election so this time he'd win. All of that in the moment our nation came the closest to being a banana republic, unless you count any given 3-hour stretch in the life of Jim Jordan. Trump was on the verge of naming Powell special counsel to make the palace coup against the incoming Biden administration look legal or constitutional or non-seditious. Special counsel to investigate fraud in the 2020 presidential election, to find an excuse to cancel it. And then when attorney Eric Hirschman threatened to beat the crap out of Flynn during the meeting, and he and the others talked Trump out of doing that, and he sent her and Flynn packing, Sidney Powell still believed he was going to appoint her special counsel. Instead, at 11 minutes after midnight on the morning of December 19th, they escorted her and Flynn and Giuliani and the Patrick Byrne guy out of the White House, and all seemed quiet. But 101 minutes later, Trump got on Twitter and wrote, "Statistically impossible to have lost the 2020 election. Big protest in D.C. on January 6th. Be there, will be wild." And the die was cast not for seizing voting machines, but instead for a coup based on ignoring the Constitution and turning the nation's future over to fascist idiots like John Eastman and Jeffrey Clark and Sidney Powell and Kenneth Cheesebro. And Sidney Powell is the linchpin in all of that. Go down any tentacle and she's there. She can give direct firsthand testimony about what was said in that meeting before Hirschman and the other White House lawyers found out about it and burst into the room to stop it. She can give direct firsthand testimony about where the crazy Cuba theories came from. She can give direct firsthand testimony about where the crazy China theories came from. She can give direct firsthand testimony about where the crazy Venezuela theories came from. She can give direct firsthand testimony about what Trump wanted to do about using the military and the National Guard. She can give direct firsthand testimony about what Trump wanted to do about seizing voting machines. She can give direct firsthand testimony that could put Flynn in jail and maybe Giuliani in jail and, most importantly, Trump in jail. And she can give direct firsthand testimony about why Trump ultimately didn't do any of the things they discussed in that meeting, and who told him it was nonsense, and when they told him that, and who told him he had lost, and what Trump said when he was told he had lost, and what Trump told them as they all left, and what Trump told her after December 19th. And Sidney Powell can give, forgive the use of the phrase again, direct firsthand testimony about, to quote yet another cartoon figure, Donald Rumsfeld, all the unknown unknowns. Is it possible that she shared the Coffee County, Georgia voting machine breach plan with Trump? Did Trump talk fake Georgia electors with her? Did she walk in there knowing these crazy ideas were crazy? Was she perhaps convinced Trump really had lost? And did she know that, in fact, these were all really just rationalizations for a coup? And she can give direct firsthand testimony about that will be wild tweet. Did Trump mention it or anything like it during the meeting in the White House? Did he reveal his plans for January 6th to them on December 18th? Did he say something like, I don't know, so sounds like this voting machine thing isn't going to work, but I've got another idea? And Sidney Powell could even know the answer to the $64 million question. Did Trump say at that meeting that he knew he had lost? When the lawyers all said that Powell and Flynn and the others had no evidence, and they drew up stiffly with offense about the lack of loyalty to the plan and to their holy master, did Trump say, I know there's no evidence. I know I lost, but what the hell? Let's go for it anyway. Jack Smith's Washington indictment, item 8, quote, the defendant enlisted co-conspirators to assist him in his criminal efforts to overturn the legitimate results of the 2020 presidential election and retain power. Among these were co-conspirator 3, an attorney whose unfounded claims of election fraud the defendant privately acknowledged to others sounded, quote, crazy. Nonetheless, the defendant embraced and publicly amplified co-conspirator 3's disinformation. Co-conspirator 3 is, of course, Sidney Powell, and co-conspirator 3 just pleaded guilty to election interference. And if nothing else I've posited here pays off, she is central to the destruction of what is already the outline of the Trump defense, the advice of counsel argument that he was only doing what his lawyers told him to do. Because if her claims sounded crazy, or if he knew he lost, or both, he must have clearly hired those lawyers because their claims were crazy, or because he knew he lost. He clearly hired lawyers so if it went wrong, he could blame them. It is the quintessential Trump. But he actually missed the boat here because the advice of counsel defense is not valid if you and your lawyers know that you're all full of spit. The other thing is Kenneth Chesebro's trial is supposed to start Monday now, too. And he is even a straighter line between things like the Eastman plan and the Seize the Voting Machines plan and January 6th itself because he was in the crowd at January 6th, caught on video. Wave to the camera, Ken. Sidney Powell just flipped, Ken. She's the first domino, Ken. Make a deal, Ken. There is understandable disappointment that as brazen and amoral a figure as Sidney Powell will get away with a slap on the wrist and without prison time. But remember, as Judge McAfee in Georgia told her bluntly, quote, "You are to testify truthfully against any and all co-defendants in this matter at any upcoming proceedings," unquote. Now we're remaking witness for the prosecution. She already recorded a statement for prosecutors in Georgia. She has to turn over documents to prosecutors in Georgia. She has to write an apology to the residents of the state of Georgia, and that means today we are all residents of the state of Georgia. Yeah, it's a slap on the wrist. If she helps pull down Trump, I don't care if she got a slap on the wrist. Hell, I don't care if she got a kiss on the mouth. She's flipped on Trump. Oh, Nancy.
Schöner Gatterfunke, Tochter aus Elysium. Wir betreten feuertrunken, himmlische dein Heiligtum. Deiner Söhne binden wieder, was der Mutter singet. Alle Menschen werden Brüder, wo dein sanfter Flügel weht.
Danke, Nancy Faust. Oh, and General Mike Flynn, FOK? FOK. Friend of Kraken. Mike Flynn now says QAnon is, quote, a major psy-op, and, quote, the nonsense about Trump is still the president and the military is coming to the rescue is just that, nonsense. And you can guess the reaction from Q World to that. If Mike Flynn thinks the military deposing Biden and reinstalling Trump is nonsense, the next thing you're going to expect us to believe is that JFK and JFK Jr. have not been reanimated, and Alex Jones is just in it for the money. I haven't seen it yet, but I know there has to be a post out there somewhere insisting Flynn has been replaced by a body double, or Flynn's body double has been replaced by a new body double. As for me, my theory is, having rejected the Qs, Flynn will also flip in Georgia just to get somebody to listen to him talk. There was another development in Jack Smith's subversion prosecution of Trump last night that got even less attention than Sidney's story did. Smith has answered the motion to dismiss based on the wild Trump claim that since he was president when he tried to destroy the country, he has, quote, absolute immunity from criminal prosecution. 54 pages from Jack Smith about how in the hell is that supposed to work if this nation has criminally prosecuted, quote, the vice president, members of the cabinet, senators, representatives, and judges, as well as governors, mayors, sheriffs, and more. Smith also notes that the entirety of the fake electors scheme has nothing to do with the responsibilities of president, so even if there were presidential immunity, it wouldn't apply. By the way, you get presidential immunity by drinking bleach. Anyway, Smith also sent Judge Chutkan the highly respected opinions on the criminal liability of sitting presidents expressed by Trump's 2021 impeachment lawyers, who, as you may recall, and Smith did recall, said that Trump could not be impeached by the Senate because he was now a former president, and former presidents could only be subjected to being charged for presidential crimes by criminal prosecutors. In other words, they're arguing exactly the opposite of what they're arguing today. As an aside, the madness of King Trump is so profound and so evil that there is one Smith paragraph that I had to read twice because I could not be certain if it was theoretical and a little hyperbolic or if Trump had committed another 273 crimes that we don't know about yet. I mean, listen to this. Quote, it would grant absolute immunity from criminal prosecution to a president who accepts a bribe in exchange for a lucrative government contract for a family member. Well, it sounds like Trump. For, quote, a president who instructs his FBI director to plant incriminating evidence on a political enemy. Well, that sounds like Trump. A president who orders the National Guard to murder his most prominent critics. Wait, did Trump do that? Did he order the National Guard to murder me and 500 other guys? What was I doing, SportsCenter at the time? Could they have told me about that? And, quote, or a president who sells nuclear secrets to a foreign adversary. As I said, I had to read that paragraph twice before deciding it was theoretical and hyperbolic. But clearly, it was theoretical extrapolated from Trump reality. The only words in the phrase, a president who sells nuclear secrets to a foreign adversary, that are not on the record already are sells and adversary. You know, if they really want to punish Sidney Powell, they ought to make her run for Speaker of the House. Jim Jordan meets with everybody who voted against him. All of them say they're going to again vote against him. Some of them tell him there will be more who will vote against him, so naturally, he will not withdraw from the race for Speaker of the House. He just got them to postpone the vote from yesterday to today. Because, I guess, some election deniers are psychopathic opportunists like Trump, and some are anti-democracy partisans until they see them jail cell doors opening for them. And some of them, like Jim Jordan, are really bat-spit crazy. And they think that overnight, those 22 fellow Republicans were going to be visited in their dreams by Jesus, or Jacob Marley's ghost, or they were replaced by body doubles overnight, or who knows what. In short, this just in, Jim Jordan, election denier, denies election.
We made the pitch to members on the resolution as a way to lower the temperature and get back to work. We decided that wasn't where we're going to go. I'm still running for Speaker, and I plan to go to the floor and get the votes and win this race. But I want to go talk with a few of my colleagues. Particularly, I want to talk with the 20 individuals who voted against me so that we can move forward and begin to work for the American people.
22, Jimbo. Not 20. 20 was the first vote. 22 voted against you. I mean, maybe you're stretching this election denier thing a little thin. 22. If you missed the whole thing yesterday, Jordan came up with a new plan in which he would be the power behind the throne until January, when they'd have another vote, and until then, Patrick McHenry would be McSpeaker, but with enhanced superpowers. And then, in January, Jordan was certain they would make him Speaker. This went over so well that McHenry himself said that if they did that without a vote, he would quit. And the next person on the emergency fill-in list that all speakers are required to submit would now succeed him as the second emergency temporary speaker. Even the idea of bringing this extra constitutional scheme to a vote was unpopular because all of a sudden you would be changing the nature of the job of Speaker of the House from somebody elected by Congress to somebody who was appointed by his predecessor. There would never be another election for Speaker. You wouldn't have to have one. And as much as unelected power naturally appeals to the Republican Party, Republicans are not going for this because it reduces their individual chances to become Speaker someday themselves. And at this rate, they'll all become Speaker of the House someday themselves. Then there was the near fist fight. That was fun. McCarthy was addressing the Republican conference when Matt Gaetz tried to interrupt him, and McCarthy told him to sit down, and Mike Bost of the Illinois 12th started swearing at Gaetz and told him it was all his fault, and then, according to a witness, quote, got all emotional. Still, for me, in a day when the Republicans firmly established that their brand is only breaking stuff, never fixing stuff, never replacing stuff, never having a plan to deal with stuff, there are three quotes that top all else. Jim Banks of the Indiana Third, quote, "We don't deserve the majority," unquote. I'd like to offer my condolences to the 250 Democratic campaign congressional advertising men that Jim Banks just put out of business, because all you need to do is just keep running that, quote, "We don't deserve the majority" on a loop next year. Then there's Lauren Boebert. The Republicans, she explains, are having such trouble electing speakers because they're great. Because they're all alpha males and alpha females. Quote, "We are here because we convince hundreds of thousands of people that we are leaders." So, Bobo, which are you, one of the alpha males or one of the alpha females? Congresswoman Boebert explaining that she'll handle it, and she promises you won't be jerked around. And then lastly, Nancy, "Thank you for inviting me to this prayer breakfast. I postponed sex to come here today, Mace." One of the 8 who voted to unseat McCarthy with no plan for what happened after that, thus triggering this mess, responding to a tweet from Congressman Greg Murphy of North Carolina that suggested that, maybe she should apologize for all this. And Mace wrote back, "If you want to vote against the people who elected you, that's on you. But I'm going to stand with them, not Washington." For context, tried to reply, but he blocked me after posting this. What a... And then Nancy Mace put in a cat emoji. Thank you for inviting me to this Twitter fight. I postponed sex to come here today. President Biden last night on Israel and Gaza and Hamas. It may be remembered as one of the best, if not the best, speeches of his presidency. He was firm. He was unequivocal. He was strong, as he has been in recent days before he went to Israel and while he was over there. My assessment, not my words. What I just read you was a quote from last night from Brit Hume on Fox News. Let's all tune in today to see where Brit's working now, because cardinal tenets of Fox World clashed here. Unquestioning support for Israel because of the whole evangelical conversion rapture thing, and unquestioning conviction that Biden is not firm, is not unequivocal, is not strong, is not capable of giving a speech. I mentioned yesterday that the Gaza Hospital Scam did not even survive 24 hours before it was debunked. It has somehow gotten even more debunked and even more scammier. CNN, quoting U.S. intelligence community assessments curated by the Director of National Intelligence, they are confident Israel was not responsible for the damage to the parking lot. They are confident of a lot more than that. The assessment made for the House and the Senate notes that there was, quote, "only light structural damage at the hospital," and that the correct assessment of fatalities was not the 500 claimed by Hamas, but something at the, quote, "low end of the 100 to 300 spectrum," unquote. And there will be millions enraged at this assessment, enraged that hundreds of Palestinians did not die while camped at a place of seeming sanctuary, which probably should tell you all you need to know here, especially if, like me, you were initially deceived by Hamas's unconscionable lies after the explosion. For the rest of us, who like to hear that people are not dead, the news is getting better and better. Agence France Presse, anonymously quoting a European intelligence source who implies that the American estimate of as few as 100 dead is still too high. The AFP source says, quote, "There are not 200 or 500 dead, but rather a few dozen, probably between 10 and 50. Also of interest here, massive criticism over an Iowa school board banning 68 books, including A Handmaid's Tale and some of Toni Morrison's works. The reason for the criticism? They're making a neighboring Iowa school board look bad. That school board had banned 400 books. That's next. This is Countdown.
This is Countdown with Keith Olbermann.
last voice you heard was Kenny Mayne. I swear to God, yesterday I'm walking up Riverside Drive here in Manhattan. I get a text from Kenny. I look up from the phone, and walking towards me is Chris Fowler. I'm supposed to see Chris Berman over the weekend. Alumni Days for ESPN. Still ahead on Countdown. Fridays with Thurber, and if the Kraken has flipped, we must once again let Mr. Thurber salute the greatest man in the world. First, though, time for the daily roundup of the miscreants, morons, and Dunning-Kruger effect specimens who constitute today's worst persons in the world. The bronze, Governor Jim Pillen of Nebraska, a place the rest of us used to take seriously. The reporter Yen-Chi Shu of the Flatwater Free Press of Omaha just won an award for a series of investigative pieces, including one about how Governor Pillen's hog farm business is filling the state's rivers with dangerous nitrates. A radio call-in show in Nebraska asked the governor about Yen-Chi's story, and he replied, quote, "Number one, I didn't read it, and I won't. Number two, all you got to do is look at the author. The author is from communist China. What more do you need to know?" Unquote. Hey, Gov, apart from the xenophobia and the racism and the sexism and the stupidity, you're a tool of the Ricketts family, and you're a pig farmer? Where in the hell did you get the idea you can look down on somebody else? The runners-up, CNN. You may recall that NBC News announced it will carry the third Republican presidential debate next month. And apart from the big picture question, did anybody see the first two debates? Who in the hell is going to watch a third one? There is the small matter of the debate partners NBC agreed to, Rumble, home of people like Andrew Tate, and Salem Radio, home of people like Charlie Execute Joe Biden Kirk. I noted when this was announced that none of NBC's supposedly liberal stars like Maddow or Chris Hayes or Lawrence O'Donnell had made enough money yet to find the courage to say anything about their employers whoring themselves out to get a Republican debate. None of them have said anything. They're joining in the whoring out at NBC. Well, guess what? Republican National Committee spokesman Keith Schipper tells The Spectator that his committee was pitched on carrying that debate or some future fourth Republican debate with Rumble and Salem as debate partners, pitched by CNN. CNN wanted to, still wants to, do a Republican debate with Rumble and Salem Radio. Salem, as in the witch trials. CNN's media team asked CNN for a comment, but CNN would not comment to CNN because if you think CNN has exorcised Chris Licht yet, you're crazy. But our winners, the Community School District of Iowa City, Iowa, which has announced it has removed 68 books from its school libraries because a new Senate bill in that state bans books with sex in them. And that law is so vague that they don't know if keeping that 68 book supply will make them or their employees liable for prosecution. The 68 titles include The Handmaid's Tale and Toni Morrison's The Bluest Eye, and the list is also notable because it is comparatively short. In July, Urbandale, Iowa, removed nearly 400 books, including The Catcher in the Rye and Catch-22, and 1984, which is about, among many other things, destroying people's faith in truth by banning books and rewriting history. Now, apart from Eric Blair, who wrote 1984 under his pen name George Orwell, coming back from the beyond to level Iowa with one blink, there is a solution to this. I have offered it before. In states with book bans or other fascist or theocratic regulations, the universities and the colleges of the other states should simply declare that high school degrees from Iowa schools are insufficient for admission. You have a degree from Iowa? I'm sorry, you can't get into Binghamton State. The book bans would, within a week, be themselves banned. The Iowa City, Iowa Community School District, only 68 books banned. What are we paying you people for? Today's worst persons in the world! Fridays with Thurber now, and looking to our other back of the book feature, as they call it, there is a short film of this story. I don't think it really does it justice. I don't think anything does it justice. Occasionally, real life does do it justice. I've thought I've seen this story playing out in real time in this country almost every day for about 7 years. Sit back and relax, if relax is the right word for it, for The Greatest Man in the World by James Thurber. Looking back on it now from the vantage point of 1940, one can only marvel that it had not happened long before it did. The United States of America had been, ever since Kitty Hawk, blindly constructing the elaborate petard by which sooner or later it must be hoist. It was inevitable that someday there would come roaring out of the skies a national hero of insufficient intelligence, background, and character successfully to endure the mounting orgies of glory prepared for aviators who stayed up for a long time or flew a great distance. Both Lindbergh and Byrd, fortunately for national decorum and international amity, had been gentlemen. So had our other famous aviators. They wore their laurels gracefully, withstood the awful weather of publicity, married excellent women, usually of fine family, and quietly retired to private life and the enjoyment of their varying fortunes. No untoward incidents on a worldwide scale marred the perfection of their conduct on the perilous heights of fame. The exception to the rule was, however, bound to occur, and it did. In July 1937, when Jack Pal Smirch, erstwhile mechanic's helper, in a small garage in Westfield, Iowa, flew a second-hand, single-motored, Breasthaven Dragonfly 3 monoplane all the way around the world without stopping. Never before in the history of aviation had such a flight as Smirch's even been dreamed of. No one had even taken seriously the weird floating auxiliary gas tanks, invention of the mad New Hampshire professor of astronomy, Dr. Charles Lewis Gresham, upon which Smirch placed full reliance. When the garage worker, a slightly built, surly, unprepossessing young man of 22, appeared at Roosevelt Field early in July 1937, slowly chewing a great quid of scrap tobacco, and announced, "Nobody ain't seen no flying yet." The newspapers touched briefly and satirically upon his projected 25,000-mile flight. Aeronautical and automotive experts dismissed the idea curtly, implying that it was a hoax, a publicity stunt. The rusty, battered, second-hand plane wouldn't go. The Gresham auxiliary tanks wouldn't work. It was simply a cheap joke. Smirch, however, after calling on a girl in Brooklyn who worked in the flap-folding department of a large paper box factory, a girl whom he later described as his sweet patootie, climbed nonchalantly into his ridiculous plane at dawn of the memorable 7th of July, 1937, spit a curve of tobacco juice into the still air, and took off, carrying with him only a gallon of bootleg gin and 6 pounds of salami. When the garage boy thundered out over the ocean, the papers were forced to record in all seriousness that a mad, unknown young man, his name was variously misspelled, had actually set out upon a preposterous attempt to span the world in a rickety one-engine contraption, trusting to the long-distance refueling device of a crazy schoolmaster. When 9 days later, without having stopped once, the tiny plane appeared above San Francisco Bay, headed for New York, spluttering and choking to be sure, but still magnificently and miraculously aloft, the headlines, which long since had crowded everything else off the front page, even the shooting of the governor of Illinois by the Valetti gang, swelled to unprecedented size, and the news stories began to run to 25 and 30 columns. It was noticeable, however, that the accounts of the epoch-making flight touched rather lightly upon the aviator himself. This was not because the facts about the hero as a man were too meager, but because They were too complete. Reporters who had been rushed out to Iowa when Smirch's plane was first sighted over the little French coast town of Cergy-le-Mer to dig up the story of the great man's life had promptly discovered that the story of his life could not be printed. His mother, a sullen short-order cook in a shack restaurant on the edge of a tourist's camping ground near Westfield, met all inquiries as to her son with an angry, the hell with him. I hope he drowns." His father appeared to be in jail somewhere for stealing spotlights and lap robes from tourists' automobiles. His young brother, a weak-minded lad, had but recently escaped from the Preston, Iowa reformatory and was already wanted in several western towns for the theft of money order blanks from post offices. These alarming discoveries were still piling up at the very time that Pal Smirch, the greatest hero of the 20th century, blear-eyed, dead for sleep, half-starved, was piloting his crazy junk heap high above the region in which the lamentable story of his private life was being unearthed, headed for New York and a greater glory than any man of his time had ever known. The necessity for printing some account in the papers of the young man's career and personality had led to a remarkable predicament. It was, of course, impossible to reveal the facts, for a tremendous popular feeling in favor of the young hero had sprung up like a grass fire when he was halfway across Europe on his flight around the globe. He was, therefore, described as a modest chap, taciturn, blonde, popular with his friends, popular with girls. The only available snapshot of Smirch, taken at the wheel of a phony automobile in a cheap photo studio at an amusement park, was touched up so that the little vulgarian looked quite handsome. His twisted leer was smoothed into a pleasant smile. The truth was, in this way, kept from the youth's ecstatic compatriots. They did not dream that the Smirch family was despised and feared by its neighbors in the obscure Iowa town, nor that the hero himself, because of numerous unsavory exploits, had come to be regarded in Westfield as a nuisance and a menace. Pal Smirch had, the reporters discovered, once knifed the principal of his high school. Not mortally, to be sure, but he had knifed him. And on another occasion, surprised in the act of stealing an altar cloth from a church, he had bashed the sexton over the head with a pot of Easter lilies. For each of these offenses, he had served a sentence in the reformatory. Inwardly, the authorities, both in New York and in Washington, prayed that an understanding Providence might, however awful such a thing seemed, bring disaster to the rusty, battered plane and its illustrious pilot, whose unheard-of flight had aroused the civilized world to hosannas of hysterical praise. The authorities were convinced that the character of the renowned aviator was such that the limelight of adulation was bound to reveal him to all the world as a congenital hooligan, mentally and morally unequipped to cope with his own prodigious fame. "I trust," said the Secretary of State at one of the many secret cabinet meetings called to consider the national dilemma, "I trust that his mother's prayer will be answered," by which he referred to Mrs. Emma Smirch's wish that her son might be drowned. It was, however, too late for that. Smirch had leaped the Atlantic and then the Pacific as if they were mill ponds. At 3 minutes after 2 o'clock on the afternoon of July 17th, 1937, the garage boy brought his idiotic plane into Roosevelt Field for a perfect three-point landing. It had, of course, been out of the question to arrange a modest little reception for the greatest flyer in the history of the world. He was received at Roosevelt Field with such elaborate and pretentious ceremonies as rocked the world. Fortunately, however, the worn and spent hero promptly swooned, had to be removed bodily from his plane, and was spirited from the field without having opened his mouth once. Thus, he did not jeopardize the dignity of his first reception, a reception illumined by the presence of the Secretaries of War and the Navy, Mayor Michael J. Moriarty of New York, the Premier of Canada, Governors Fanaman, Groves, McFeely, and Critchfield, and a brilliant array of European diplomats. Smirch did not, in fact, come to in time to take part in the gigantic hullabaloo arranged at City Hall for the next day. He was rushed to a secluded nursing home and confined in bed. It was 9 days before he was able to get up, or to be more exact, before he was permitted to get up. Meanwhile, the greatest minds in the country in solemn assembly had arranged a secret conference of city, state, and government officials, which Smirch was to attend for the purpose of being instructed in the ethics and behavior of heroism. On the day that the little mechanic was finally allowed to get up and dress, and for the first time in 2 weeks took a great chew of tobacco, he was permitted to receive the newspaper men, this by way of testing him out. Smirch did not wait for questions. "Yous guys," he said, and the Times man winced. "Yous guys can tell the cockeyed world that I put it over on Lindbergh, see? Yeah, made an ass of them two frogs." The two frogs was a reference to a pair of gallant French flyers who, in attempting a flight only halfway around the world, had 2 weeks before unhappily been lost at sea. The Times man was bold enough at this point to sketch out for Smirch the accepted formula for interviews in cases of this kind. He explained that there should be no arrogant statements belittling the achievements of other heroes, particularly heroes of foreign nations. "To hell with that," said Smirch. "I did it, see? I did it, and I'm talking about it." And he did talk about it. None of this extraordinary interview was, of course, printed. On the contrary, the newspapers, already under the disciplined direction of a secret directorate created for the occasion and composed of statesmen and editors, gave out to a panting and restless world that Jackie, as he had been arbitrarily nicknamed, would consent to say only that he was very happy and that anyone could have done what he did. "My achievement has been, I fear, slightly exaggerated," the Times man's article had him protest with a modest smile. These newspaper stories were kept from the hero, a restriction which did not serve to abate the rising malevolence of his temper. The situation was indeed extremely grave, for pal Smirch was, as he kept insisting, rarin' to go. He could not much longer be kept from a nation clamorous to lionize him. It was the most desperate crisis the United States of America had faced since the sinking of the Lusitania. On the afternoon of the 27th of July, Smirch was spirited away to a conference room in which were gathered mayors, governors, government officials, behaviorist psychologists, and editors. He gave them each a limp, moist paw and a brief, unlovely grin. "Hiya," he said. When Smirch was seated, the mayor of New York arose and, with obvious pessimism, attempted to explain what he must say and how he must act when presented to the world, ending his talk with a high tribute to the hero's courage and integrity. The mayor was followed by Governor Fetterman of New York, who, after a touching declaration of faith, introduced Cameron Spottiswoode, second secretary of the American Embassy in Paris, the gentleman selected to coach Smirch in the amenities of public ceremonies. Sitting in a chair with a soiled yellow tie in his hand and his shirt open at the throat, unshaved, smoking a rolled cigarette, Jack Smirch listened with a leer on his lips. I get you, he cut in nastily. "You want me to act like a softy, huh? You want me to act like that mebbity baby face Lindbergh, huh? Well, nuts to that, see?" Everyone took in his breath sharply. It was a sigh and a hiss. "Mr. Lindbergh," began a United States senator, purple with rage, "and Mr. Byrd," Smirch, who was paring his nails with a jackknife, cut in again. "Boyd," he exclaimed, "for God's sake, that big—" Somebody shut off the blasphemies with a sharp word. A newcomer had entered the room. Everyone stood up except Smirch, who was still busy with his nails, and he did not even glance up. "Mr. Smirch," said someone sternly, "the President of the United States." It had been thought that the presence of the chief executive might have a chastening effect on the young hero, and the former had been, thanks to the remarkable cooperation of the press, secretly brought to the obscure conference room. A great, painful Silence fell. Smirch looked up, waved a hand at the president. "How you coming?" he asked, and began rolling a fresh cigarette. The silence deepened. Someone coughed in a strained way. "Geez, it's hot, ain't it?" said Smirch. He loosened 2 more shirt buttons, revealing a hairy chest and the tattooed word Sadie enclosed in a stenciled heart. The great and important men in the room, faced by the most serious crisis in American history, exchanged worried frowns. Nobody seemed to know how to proceed. Come on, said Smirch. "Let's get the hell out of here. When do I start cutting in on the parties, huh? And when is there gonna be this in it?" He rubbed a thumb and forefinger together meaningly. "Money?" exclaimed a state senator, shocked, pale. "Yeah, money," said Powell, flipping his cigarette out of the window. "And big money." He began rolling a fresh cigarette. "Big money," he repeated, frowning over the rice paper. He tilted back in his chair and leered at each gentleman separately. The leer of an animal that knows its power. The leer of a leopard loose in a bird and dog shop. For God's sake, let's get someplace where it's cooler," he said. "I've been cooped up plenty for 3 weeks. Smirch stood up and walked over to an open window, where he stood staring down into the street 9 floors below. The faint shouting of newsboys floated up to him. He made out his name. "Hot dog!" he cried, grinning, ecstatic. He leaned out over the sill. "You tell 'em, babies!" he shouted down. "Hot diggity dog!" In the tense little knot of men standing behind him, a quick, mad impulse flared up. An unspoken word of appeal, of command, seemed to ring through the room, yet it was deadly silent. Charles K. L. Brand, secretary to the mayor of New York City, happened to be standing nearest Smirch. He looked inquiringly at the President of the United States. The President, pale, grim, nodded shortly. Brand, a tall, powerfully built man, once a tackle at Rutgers University, stepped forward, seized the greatest man in the world by his left shoulder and the seat of his pants, and pushed him out the window. "My God, he's fallen out the window!" cried a quick-witted editor. "Get me out of here!" cried the president. Several men sprang to his side, and he was hurriedly escorted out of a door toward a side entrance of the building. The editor of the Associated Press took charge, being used to such things. Crisply, he ordered certain men to leave, others to stay. Quickly, he outlined a story which all the papers were to agree on, sent 2 men to the street to handle that end of the tragedy, commanded a senator to sob, and 2 congressmen to go to pieces nervously. In a word, he skillfully set the stage for the gigantic task that was to follow, the task of breaking to a grief-stricken world the sad story of the untimely, accidental death of its most illustrious and spectacular figure. The funeral was, as you know, the most elaborate, the finest, the solemnest, and the saddest ever held in the United States of America. The monument in Arlington Cemetery, with its clean white shaft of marble and the simple device of a tiny plane carved on its base, is a place for pilgrims in deep reverence to visit. The nations of the world paid lofty tributes to little Jackie Smirch, America's greatest hero. At a given hour, there were 2 minutes of silence throughout the nation. Even the inhabitants of the small, bewildered town of Westfield, Iowa, observed this touching ceremony. Agents of the Department of Justice saw to that. One of them was especially assigned to stand grimly in the doorway of a little shack restaurant on the edge of the tourists' camping ground just outside the town. There, under his stern scrutiny, Mrs. Emma Smirch bowed her head over 2 hamburger steaks sizzling on her grill, bowed her head and turned away so that the Secret Service man could not see the twisted, strangely familiar leer on her lips. The greatest man in the world by James Thurber. I've done all the damage I can do here. Thank you for listening. The music you heard was, for the most part, arranged, produced, and performed by Countdown's musical directors, Brian Ray and John Philip Chenale. Brian Ray handled guitars, bass, and drums. John Philip Chenale on orchestration and keyboards. It was produced by TKO Brothers. Other music, including some Beethoven, arranged and performed by the group No Horns Allowed. Sports music, courtesy of ESPN Inc., written by Mitch Warren Davis, called the Olbermann theme from ESPN2. Our satirical and pithy musical comments are by Nancy Faust, the best baseball stadium organist ever. Our announcer today was my friend Kenny Mayne. Everything else was pretty much my fault. So that's Countdown for this, the 1018th day since Donald Trump's first attempted coup against the democratically elected government of the United States. Convict him now while we still can, and don't forget, flip my Kraken. The next scheduled countdown is Tuesday. Bulletins as the news warrants. Till then, I'm Keith Olbermann. Good morning, good afternoon, good night, and good luck.